Now, there we go. So here we are at the end of a remarkable day, and I'm so delighted to see all of you here to help us close out a remarkable day. We've covered a lot of ground in the discussions that have taken place in the hallways and in the breaks and in the workshops and the breakout sessions, and what we've heard from stage. So I'm honored to have been asked to chair moderate the panel on the end of this day, so that we can draw to some of the threads that were part of our discussion into a tapestry of what the future might look like. It's a big task, but we have a fabulous panel here to help us do it. Let me just give very brief introductions because most of these folks are known to many of us, and there are certainly long bios in the program. To my immediate left is Paul Fishman, who was the U.S. Attorney for New Jersey for many years, 2009 to 2017. He now is in private practice at Arnold and Porter, a member of the Attorney General's Advisory Committee, and was the chair of that committee, a very important committee within the Justice Department. I know from personal experience this was a powerhouse group. Next to him is Judge John Gleeson, who will, for today's purposes, although I'm always respectful of judges, he'll be John, if that's okay with him. He's a partner at Debevoise & Plimpton and is also now involved in white-collar practice, as is Paul. 22 years a district judge in the Eastern District of New York, and I think all of those who watch such things will say that he was one of the most respected judges on the federal bench, wrote a number of opinions, always thoughtful, is academic. He's also taught a lot, and was chair of the Defender Services Committee for the Judicial Conference, very important position there, and he's now in private practice. So we miss him on the bench. You can always go back, John. Next to him is Doris Randle-Holt, who I'm just meeting, who is has a very interesting background as a narcotics officer after leaving college. That's interesting. Then an externship at the U.S. Attorney's Office. That's interesting. And then joined the Federal Defender's Office in the Western District of Tennessee, moving up the ranks to be first assistant, and then most recently in 2013 appointed the federal defender by the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. So a leadership position in a sector that we've not heard enough from today, in my view, and that's the federal defense, or the defense sector generally. And next to her, anybody who lives in Manhattan, is in New York, but watches what's happening in prosecution reform around the country knows Cyrus Vance Jr. We're very honored to have him here. He's been the Manhattan DA since 2010. We're going to ask him some questions about what the prosecutor reform movement looks like these days. He's very much involved as a national leader on that. And if you look at his bio, has some interesting bragging rights in terms of reducing incarceration in Manhattan, kicking a lot of low-level cases out of the court system, setting up a criminal justice investment initiative that has invested millions of dollars in alternatives to incarceration and community-based organizations, co-founder of the Prosecutors Against Gun Violence Initiative. So well-respected prosecutor, leader, and was a public defender himself in Seattle for many years. Cy has to leave at 6 because of his other commitments, so we're going to start with him. And I've told all of them that we're going to start our discussion tonight. We'll have an interactive time, but I really want to ask all of them the same question, and was prompted this morning by an observation made by Rabbi Lipskar. So with your permission, Rabbi, I want to quote back something you said this morning that I just to use as our opening gambit this evening as we start this conversation. You said, saying that you go to a prison every week and have for 30 years, how impressive is that? And based on that experience, you said to us as we started our day, so we're going to end with your statement, what we need today is not just alternatives to incarceration, the title of our conference. What we need today is a paradigm shift. Why? You said because we take human beings and we break their hearts, their minds, and their souls. That was a very powerful starting place, for an inspirational starting place, but a provocative starting place for our discussion today. So starting with you, Cy, I'd like to ask for you your thoughts. They all get advance notice I was going to ask them, so it's not really on the spot, but it's almost on the spot. Do we need a paradigm shift? And are we breaking hearts, minds, and souls the way we operate our justice system today? Cy.
Thanks, Jeremy. I do think we need paradigm shifts at several levels in our justice system. I think, first of all, we need to radically rethink who we bring into the justice system particularly with low-level offenses and offenders. If you enter the justice system early, you are more likely to have future interactions with the justice system. So to me, we absolutely need to rethink how we approach early intervention and focus on diversion, focus on alternatives to prosecution entirely. I think that is happening in Manhattan. We've reduced our intake of low-level offenses from 86,000 misdemeanors in 2012 to 45,000 last year. And that's a commitment that we're to believe, because I believe we're getting better results with actually less of a criminal justice footprint in those types of cases. Jeremy, I think with more serious felonies, I think we also, as prosecutors, need to be open-minded. And in our office, I think that this has been both an important focus, but also an education to me. So I do think that we really should be looking for alternatives to incarceration, or incarceration as the last reasonable resort. But I would just say in closing that there's also really a danger, and I don't mean that in some dramatic way. I'm just saying that really when you're dealing with violent offenses, robberies and others, incarceration may not be the best option at all. But we need to make sure that we are providing the support, the intervention, for those individuals who need it so that they succeed. We recently changed, this legislature changed the discovery and bail laws in New York State radically. And while I believe the New York State bail system really did deserve a radical overhaul, what they failed to do was to provide a single dollar of funding for an entire change in our system, but yet didn't fund the pretrial services agency that they created. I think that creates expectations, but it's going to leave us disappointed if the men and women who are coming into the system aren't helped to address many of the things that they suffer from, whether it is addiction, whether it is mental health issues, whether it is trauma. Then I'm afraid, Jeremy, that we're really not going to be solving the problem in the long run.
Thanks, Cyrus. So as we turn to you, Doris, and ask you the question, you have a unique perspective on this need for paradigm shift, and maybe a view on alternatives to incarceration, more programmatic responses to incarceration. So from where you sit, what's needed, and where are we in this moment?
Well, I do agree that we do need a paradigm shift and some alternatives to incarceration. I think first we need to start with which crimes we classify as violent crimes. You see, it seems now that just about everything is a violent offense. You know, burglary. If you go inside of a house or go inside of a building and you stay there until that building is closed and you take something, it's burglary. It's a violent offense. But the person didn't do anything violent. So I think we need to start there and declassifying some of the offenses that people are charged with. I think surely there has to be some alternatives to incarceration. We need more diversion. We need more community service type punishments. When I looked at other countries similar to the United States, I looked at the United Kingdom and I looked at France. I looked at what the United Kingdom is doing. We are 30 years behind the United Kingdom. They started different programs, alternatives to sending people to prison in 1973. They started pilots in places where when people committed offenses that normally they would go to prison for, they started putting those people in the community and setting up probation departments to make these people do types of community services so they can maintain their families, because they thought that was important. So I think, yes, we're breaking the hearts of families, the people that are being sentenced. and like you said, the children that are our future, we're breaking their hearts because you're taking those parents away from them. And the parents, even when they go to the prisons to see their families, the little children can't hug their dad. They can't hug their mothers. So, you know, we need to change that model. We need a new pattern of incarceration.
So, John, you're known as a thoughtful critic of sentencing, the federal sentencing system. And one response to those criticisms might be that that's not a paradigm shift. It's sort of within the current structure. So are you now liberated as you are from sitting on the bench? Are you up for a paradigm shift?
I didn't really feel that constrained. Is this on? Can
Check.
you, it's an odd question, can you hear me? Because
It's not on, I can't, right, exactly.
Yeah.
how about that?
Yeah. Other way. Other way. Should,
Oh, here we go. Is this working?
yep. There we go.
Okay. I didn't really feel that constrained when I was on the bench, to tell you the truth.
Mhm.
So I don't feel liberated in any sense. I do think, in answer to the question, that it's almost indisputable that we need a paradigm, that we need to fundamentally rethink where we are, and I think in positing where we should go, the best way to kind of figure out the options is to identify the landmark points that got us to where we are. So I want to emphasize my belief that you can amend Rabbi Lipsker's comment by adding that we're crushing families, we're crushing communities. And, you know, I think some of us are old enough to actually straddle the two systems, the shift from the indeterminate system that rightfully produced shameful outcomes, disparate outcomes, to a system that was supposed to produce uniformity, transparency, certainty. But for certain reasons, including historical accidents, the murder rate was 7 times what it is now, those drug offense mandatory minimums, the original commission's decision that there were too many sentences that involved no incarceration. So we got those mandatory minimums intended for a narrow slice of the caseload, the kingpins and managers, but rendered applicable to everybody in the caseload because they were pegged to type and drug type and quantity rather than role. The original commission linked the guidelines to them. The original commission, as I mentioned, decided we're going to not have a 50% non-jail rate, probation rate. And, you know, that system that was supposed to be characterized, the new system, by, as I mentioned, transparency, uniformity, certainty, it came to be characterized really by excessive severity, by severity more than anything else, and I'll suggest excessive severity, you know, built into the problem of backing out of where, and one thing I really believe they ought to hand out as swag for all these conferences is something with the graph of what happened to the prison populations in the federal system and in the state systems. It looks exactly the same. They look at where it just kind of meanders along through the first 7, 8 decades of the 20th century, and then boom, straight up. It's almost a vertical line. We screwed it up. You know, we intended to produce those salutary effects, but we screwed it up. We produced mass incarceration. We need to rethink what we're going to incarcerate people for. We've over-criminalized. We need to fundamentally rethink, you know, we have to think about the consequences of a political atmosphere in which change comes easily as long as it's adverse to a defendant. And it comes even when we all agree change is needed, if it advantages defendants, it's like turning the Queen Mary around. So we have a system that's resistant to one type of change, not the other, and so that we had that one-way ratchet for 25, 30 years. It's still pretty much a one-way ratchet, although even this past Congress, even this president, that's one way of putting it, right? Even that group of people identified certain features of the system that were just fundamentally intolerable. Those double 851 life sentences, those stacked 924Cs, even they figured it out. So, you know, we really, the number of years in prison, we got so used to the only currency with which we deal with criminal conduct is years in prison, and when you have a one-way ratchet, it just goes up and up and up. And it doesn't do anybody any good in terms of recidivism rates, really in terms of the salutary effects of incapacitation, to have a 25-year sentence as opposed to an 8-year sentence. But we've become so numb to the effects of over-incarceration. The other fundamental things we need to think about, and I agree, you know, how we incarcerate. You know, go to a prison in Germany. You know, they're not dressed in their overalls. They're dressed like normal human beings. We have no sense of a continuing responsibility to treat with some dignity human beings who have committed crimes. We've blown that out of the water. We just treat people like animals. We don't properly prepare them to re-enter. So, you know, I'll end with this. You know, whatever you think about Michelle Alexander's thesis, right, in the New Jim Crow, whatever you think she's right or wrong, shame on us for giving her all the grist for that argument. You know, we have a racially imbalanced, we have disparate racial effects of our mandatory minimums and our harsh guidelines and our absence of alternatives to incarceration, and the fact that at the back end, the collateral consequences of having a felony conviction are completely disabling. That it only overstates it slightly for people with federal felony convictions. We need to just, we fundamentally need to go back to
There's a good
square
argument for starting over. So Paul, what do you think?
So,
Paradigm shift.
So I'm going to talk about paradigm shift, but I'm going to talk about it from a slightly different angle. And I'll start with a story, and because this is being sponsored by the Aleph Society, it will be a story that revolves around Judaism. In 2015, maybe 2014, I was at Yom Kippur services at my synagogue in Bloomfield, and like lots of other synagogues, people in the congregation are effectively rewarded or honored or recognized at some point during the service in some way for financial or other contributions to the life of the community. I was in the government, so of course my contributions to the synagogue were not financial. But I think it was because I was the United States Attorney at the time that I was asked if I would lead the portion of the Kol Nidre service, the holiest night of the Jewish worship calendar. And I was asked to lead the portion of the service that involved the confession of sin, both the short version, the Ashamnu, and the long version, the Al-Chet, for those of you who are practicing. And I got up and I did this, and I was delighted to participate. The next morning, one of the very senior officers of the congregation came up to me, and he said, "Wow." He said, "You are the best federal prosecutor I have ever seen." And I thought to myself, okay, it's Yom Kippur, pride's a sin, I shouldn't be thinking about it today. And I thought to myself, we were in the middle of the Bridgegate investigation, which we had not yet charged, and I thought, well, we've been handling it with such dignity and grace, maybe he's going to compliment me for that. So I feigned ignorance and said, "So what are you talking about?" And he said, "Last night, you got 600 Jews to confess to 7 federal crimes in public." And the truth is, there's an irony to that, because the way we have measured, and Larry Krasner said this morning, the way we have measured the success of people who do what I used to do and what John used to do and what Cy still does is to look sometimes, maybe way too often, at statistics and numbers and years of incarceration. So if there's a paradigm shift for prosecutors, it needs to be that. And what was not really lost in the conversation between me and my friend Bob Rich at the next morning at Yom Kippur services, what was not lost was that Yom Kippur really is about atonement and mercy, right? It's about turning, it's about renewal of spirit, it's about repentance, and it ultimately is about forgiveness. And I think the place where we need to start thinking about a paradigm shift is where those two concepts interact. One is that the system has never dealt well with forgiveness. It has never dealt well with what happens next. We ask for defendants to be remorseful, we give them points for confession, but at the end of the day, we've never been great about that. And the second thing we need to think about is how we define the roles of the people who participate in the system. If there's a paradigm shift, it needs to be there. We've started to see it. The way we think about policing has to be different. The way we think about arrest, it has to be different. The way we measure prosecution success has to be different. The discretion that we give to judges to impose certain kinds of sentences have to be different. The way we deal with prisons has to be different. But each of the people who is in the system has to be encouraged in some serious way to rethink his or her role in the system, and not just the concept, but to be given the tools and the power and the discretion and the authority and the responsibility to change the way they think about their particular part of the system.
That is a perfect segue to my next question to Cyrus. There was a great panel earlier today, moderated by your colleague and protege, Lucy Lang, that had on it Larry Krasner, Rachel Rollins, and John Creusot. And what was so interesting about that panel, Cy, was the ways in which these newly elected prosecutors were defining their role differently. They were seeing themselves as reform agents, and talked about how they were changing their offices and hiring different types of assistants and looking at diversity among their office composition. Larry Krasner, apropos of that comment that Paul just made, dropped some numbers, which I wrote down and have tweeted already, which is he's tracking the reduced number of life years committed by his office to prison as a metric. And when you and I, Paul, were together, and Eric Holder asked a bunch of federal U.S. attorneys, what's your role in reducing mass incarceration? You know, we were searching for the metrics. So how do you think about it? And even that conversation has come forward pretty quickly. So as the DA that you are, and as having been in that sort of first wave of reform-minded prosecutors of the modern era, how much hope should we hold out for prosecutors being the agents of reform, and how do they do their jobs differently if they are the agents of reform? Because that seems to be what they're getting elected on as their campaign platform. So is that a false hope? Should we look to them for leadership? And how do we know whether they're successful?
I'm very hopeful when I look at the array of elected prosecutors around the country. I do think that if your question in the second part, Chairman, was how do we measure ourselves?
Yeah, what does success look like? Yeah.
For me, success looks like changing the focus of our work as crime fighters from strictly prosecution and punishment to prevention. Our office committed $250 million of forfeiture money to invest in prevention strategies designed to help underserved communities, to focus on victims of crime, and to help those transitioning out of prison. Now, that's unique because our office sits in a unique spot with financial crimes, but my view with that is that, to me, that's crime fighting. That is reducing crime by whatever means the district attorney, him or herself, has in her power to affect who's committing crimes and to prevent them. So prevention, I think, has become, certainly for me, and I think around the country, certainly all the prosecutors that you talked about this morning, focus very much on prevention as a core crime-fighting strategy of a prosecutor's office. Now, I call it a crime-fighting strategy because that's what they expect prosecutors to do, is to fight crime. But indeed, you can, but in a very different way by focusing on how do we get the gun from not getting to the young man's hand? That's certainly a far better outcome than prosecuting that young man for using the gun. So that is a logical, it's easy for folks to understand, I think, when you put it that way, and I think that's where prosecutors are going. Was there a second part?
Well, related to that, they had some examples. Again, I'm fascinated by what's going on in the prosecution world of ways that they were standing up against what would be traditional allies, police, for example, the roles they were playing in advocating for reform in state legislatures, sort of bucking the state associations, and sort of interesting alliances with mental health providers and the like. So it seemed like a different image of what their role was in the reform era.
Absolutely. And I think prosecutors are looking at their roles differently, no more so than the four you had this morning. And I think more and more prosecutors are understanding that our desire is to work collaboratively with police. And my goal has always been, if we're going to talk about not charging particular categories of crimes, I want to try to get the police on board in that decision and try to convince them that's a smarter way to go. And I think in many respects we've been able to do that in Manhattan. But sometimes they won't go there.
Yeah.
And then you have to make the choice. I understand, but we disagree. And in my case, the two largest arrest categories in the city are theft of services and marijuana. And our office has
Turnstile jumping,
Turnstile
for those
jumping.
of you who are from out of town.
and those are two instances where I simply could not bring the police on board at the beginning, but I think we've gone a long way down the road. I do think there's optimism, though. I think I go to conferences with other prosecutors from around the country. I think there absolutely is a sense that we're thinking about our job differently. Our community is actually expecting us to think about our job differently. But it's very tricky, and I would just leave with this in a hopeful way, but to recognize that the world in which we operate is not the federal system.
Yeah.
The federal system has, I think, accounts for about 5% of the sentences imposed or prisoners in the United States. That's a very important, obviously, body of prosecutors, defenders, and judges, but it represents by no means anywhere near the real volume of folks who are coming into the system. So it's at the state level where I think we have to make this headway. And when you have 3,000 plus counties in the United States, each of whom has an elected DA, each community having perhaps a different sensibility about what they think justice looks like, it's a generational thing we're looking at here. This is not going to be overnight.
So Doris, we're asking now about roles. So we just got the prosecutor's view of the reform here. So you'd think that public defenders would be you're closest to the clients of interest, that you'd have a sort of unique voice in the reform movement. And some people sort of wonder, what is the voice? Is there a change in the voice of the defense community? And is there a way in which you feel like you're being encouraged to break out of traditional molds as to what is expected of the defense community? Anything changing in your conversations among your colleagues?
Well, in my district, it's all about statistics. I've never practiced in state court, only in federal court. And a lot of the state crimes in the Western District of Tennessee are being prosecuted in federal court. Mm-hmm. The mom and pop store robberies is federal court. The just possession of a handgun, federal court. Possession of a shell casing, one shell casing, is being, not a bullet, but just a shell casing, it's being prosecuted in federal court. So it's all about, in my district, photo ops, statistics. I mean, we're defending everything. And we're trying these cases. The lawyers in my office, and I have to throw this in, when I took over, for 15 years, I was the only African-American lawyer in my office. And then the last 5 years before I took over, we hired one more. But now my office is 50%. They're African-Americans, Koreans, Hispanics. My office is 50% diverse in lawyers, investigators, and we're in teams. Every 2 lawyers have their own investigator. But we're trying these cases because we can't get anything. We can't reach any agreements. So we're the voice of the people that are being charged. And just last week, my lawyers won a case. So we're fighting them.
Excellent. So John, one of the themes from the day, from judges, mostly federal judges, was we do what we can within the discretion that we have, and we have a fair amount of discretion, but it's bounded. It's bounded by legislation. And actually Doris's point about what is federalized, what is not, that's a legislative and other determinations. If you could speak to, and I know you have, the Congress of the United States, about what the paradigm shift should look like, that from a judge's perspective, what would you want Congress to do differently to allow some of the reform creativity to unfold in the federal system, which overlaps with the state system in really interesting ways that you just highlighted, Doris? But just speak to, we haven't talked much about what Congress should be doing here, and it's interesting to me.
It is, and I think it is important to look at the different facets of the system, not just paradigm change for prosecutors. I agree with what Cy said, and I'll suggest this, which isn't much of a tweak, but it's a tweak. The paradigm shift should focus not on crime fighting, but on community protection, and I think you do. And I think the big change now is more and more prosecutors recognize, when Paul and I were prosecutors, I don't think we should be too hard on ourselves. We regarded there being one way to protect the community, and that is take bad people out of the community into the prisons. But I think now we live in places where the incarceration rates can go down along with the crime rates going down, and now you protect the community by building it and by not incarcerating people who shouldn't be incarcerated, for limiting the length of period, reentry, focus on reentry. To answer your question, Jeremy, this whole system that's now 30 years old was born of a notion that we can't trust the judges anymore. And even the harshest critics of the results of sentencing reform, and I consider myself among them, agree we needed to do something to fix the lawlessness, the shameful results of the pre-guidelines era of unbounded, unguided, unreviewed discretion. But we decided not to trust the judges. We learned in a way that was entirely unanticipated that, when you take discretion away from one part of the system, unless you eliminate it entirely with a schedule of punishments that are rote, we wanted to retain some discretion. It seeks its level. We relatively empowered prosecutors. So I think that has everything to do with trial rate going from roughly 85% when this era began to 3% now. I'm sorry, the guilty plea rate from 85% to 97%. We've empowered prosecutors to enlarge the delta between the expected outcome at sentencing if you plead guilty on the one hand or go to trial and blow trial on the other. And here, get rid of the mandatory minimums. That would be one. Another would be recognize our mistakes. We made mistakes. We have too many people in prison for too long. So create mechanisms to rectify those. Fine, we know we have, and do it on a human level. Thank goodness you can't get those stacked 924Cs in the first case going forward. Well, what about those guys? I got a bunch of them, they're my clients now. What about those guys who were sitting there doing a mandatory consecutive 115 years solely because they chose to go to trial? They're offered one 924C, 5 years. What do we do? We have to understand that if these conferences are fabulous. Smart people show up, policymakers show up. At the receiving end of these sentences are human beings. And they've got kids, and they got birthdays, and they got a client who's missed all 28 of his kids' birthdays because he had the temerity to insist on what we told him was a guarantee, the right to trial enshrined in the Sixth Amendment. He could have gotten 8 years, like all his co-defendants, but he's going to die in prison unless something happens. We need to feel those kind of bone-crushing, soul-crushing consequences. And enact legislation to allow for safety valves.
Yeah. I think one of the wonderful attributes of this conference and more tomorrow is the voice of those who are impacted by the justice system has been present, could be more, but it is always humanizing and reminds us of exactly the point that you made. So, Paul, you've been a U.S. attorney. We heard Cyrus talk a bit about how there's change afoot within elected DAs, interestingly sort of responding to the public demand for reform. That seems to be a winning strategy in many jurisdictions. Think with us back to the time when you were an appointed U.S. attorney, and just reflect on what should the role be of, obviously it shifts considerably, administration to administration, but what's the role of U.S. attorneys in thinking about our assignment here, winding down from mass incarceration?
Well, it's what it can be
Yeah.
and what it is are not necessarily the same
Let's
thing.
name
So
a
let
bit,
me,
okay?
so like John, I mean, I started as a federal prosecutor in the fall of 1983. Like John, pre-guidelines, pre-bail reform, and I actually did the very first detention hearing in the District of New Jersey after the Bail Reform Act, as it was then called, was passed in 1984, and so that was the vision of the system with which that I had. That was how I was taught. That's how we thought. We didn't really give it another think about it any other way. When I came back to the Justice, I left the Justice Department in 1997 after spending 11 years as an assistant U.S. attorney and 3 years working for Janet Reno in Washington. I went to private practice for 12 years, and I came back as a U.S. attorney in the Obama administration. And things were different. And they were different for a lot of reasons, I think. They were different because Barack Obama had a very different opinion about what the justice system should look like. Eric Holder had a very different view of what the justice system can and should look like. And of course, Eric's view was born not only of his federal service and lots of other things that have happened in his life, but the fact that the U.S. attorney in D.C., which is what he had been in the Clinton administration, is both the U.S. attorney and the DA. And so Eric had a view that the role of the U.S. attorney was not just the traditional role, no matter how you describe it, as crime fighting or community protection, but really was to be somebody who was a community problem solver, is the way he thought about it. And he had a bunch of very eager and willing United States attorneys who were very interested in pursuing that kind of agenda. And relatively quickly, we got involved in all sorts of things. We started a prisoner reentry court in New Jersey and a bunch of places around the country where they hadn't been started before. When Chris Dozier, who's the head of our magnificent head of our pretrial services unit in New Jersey, got with Judge Salas and Judge Hayden and said we should have a pretrial opportunity court. We endorsed that and got on board, and we had some heated conversations about what it was going to look like, but in the end, it's been quite a success. The U.S. attorneys got very involved in police reform. It's been quite, it's been talked about a lot when Attorney General Sessions said we're not doing that anymore in this administration. But until he said that, there were lots of U.S. attorneys around the country who were very involved with the Civil Rights Division in very sort of serious deep dive investigations that resulted in consent decrees and in lots of other ways in trying to work with police departments who are in many ways I was in Newark, the most significant partner we had, except for the FBI, in doing criminal investigations in North Jersey was the Newark Police Department, and they were not behaving the way they needed to behave, and we needed to fix that. We did something that U.S. attorneys had historically not really done, which was real community outreach. It used to be that the U.S. attorneys would get invitations from the Chamber of Commerce or a synagogue or a church or a mosque or some other civic organization and go speak if it was sort of consistent with the kind of thing you wanted to do. But that changed a lot in the Obama administration, and people were out all the time, so much so that a bunch of U.S. attorneys, including me, hired community outreach coordinators to help us manage that docket. And in fact, my community outreach coordinator, a woman I hired, Mikey Sherrill, is now the congresswoman from New Jersey's 11th district, which is totally great. But here's what I see now, is I see a backslide. And Cy, you're totally right. John's totally right. It's 5%, 7%, whatever the number is. But if the Attorney General of the United States is not out making a speech about this kind of stuff, if the Attorney General of the United States is not encouraging the 93 United States attorneys around the country to be this kind of prosecutor, right. It's true, in numbers you don't lose stuff, but you do lose that image kind of Nixon going to China, because the way this works is if you have to have the way it worked for us in New Jersey is you have a prosecutor playing a little bit against type for what the public expects that person to be doing. And so you have this crusade, and it is a crusade, being led by people who have been steeped in law enforcement for a long time, who say to people, you know, like John just did, we made some really serious mistakes, and we need to fix this in a way that actually works. And the thing that disappoints me, honestly, Jeremy, and I don't know whether it's design or by happenstance, is there are a lot of DAs here, there are a lot of judges here, there's some former federal U.S. attorneys. I don't think the United States Department of Justice really has a presence at this conference, and I think it's because they are not leading this charge in the way that it was happening over the last decade, and I think that's really a bad thing. There are a lot of quarrels I have with the administration, and this may not be the biggest one, but it is certainly an absence that I feel.
So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take some time for questions. It's a good way to end a day, to get some things into the mix. I'm sorry, my back is to half the room here. So start thinking of your precise, terse, perfectly formulated, non-speech question, okay? You get the message. We're going to do a quick lightning round with our guests. We're going to start with Cyrus because he has to leave for a very important engagement. Maybe you'll share that celebration that you're going to. Quick lightning round, and then we'll open up for questions, okay? Is that a deal? Okay. And I'm brutal for people who don't ask terse questions, so just work on it. What are you worried about? So there's always the issue now, the crusade is the word, sort of the sense of a movement, that something will be a bridge too far. That something might be a little bit, we've had some big topics on the table here today, legalization, expungement, decriminalization, lots of things that are, perhaps would be a bridge too far. There's always the risk, someone mentioned to me outside of the awful case, the Willie Horton effect. So I'd like to know, is there anything where you say to yourself, maybe not that one now, or maybe later, or maybe never, to keep the forward momentum? But then the second thing is one reason for hope. And I'm going to stand up just because we're going to start moving this around a little bit. Cyrus,
I'm hopeful.
any concern? What might be a bridge too far?
It's a case-by-case situation, and I said when I ran for DA that I'm going to look at every question through the lens of two other questions. Does it make us safer? And does it move the justice system toward fairness? And if I answer on any issue affirmatively with those two questions, I feel like I'm going in the right direction. If I can't affirmatively through evaluation, knowledge, facts, if I can't answer the question that's being posed to me, then I pause. But every individual case can turn out to be
Right.
a success or not a success.
Right, great. Doris.
I'm hopeful that one day Congress will either abolish the sentencing guidelines or rewrite them, because I think they created mayhem in the communities for people of color. They have not done anything good for us. I'm hoping that one day that I talked to the congressman that was here, Congressman Jeffries, and I talked to him about judicial diversion. And he said, wow, I said, well, I've written my congressman in the Western District of Tennessee, and I've written Senator Lamar Alexander, and I've asked them about judicial diversion. I said, simply because you sided with the First Step Act, it's been established, but in my district, not one person has been released. I personally filed 22 motions, and we haven't gotten one person out of jail yet under the First Step Act.
What are your concerns? Anything we should pay attention to that you wonder whether the movement's got too much momentum or going too far, or anything that horizon that you're worried about?
Oh, no.
Okay.
We need to go full steam ahead.
Great, okay. John Gleeson.
I think we are so fundamentally, utterly incapable of accomplishing anything that would be a bridge too far. My fear is the wrongful perception of a bridge too far, and that is some reform. We're terrible when it comes to bad anecdotes. We can turn on a dime in a way that's adverse to the entire defendant population if there's a single incident. So my concern is there'll be a reform from which someone will benefit. That person will commit a violent crime. That's going to happen. Otherwise we would incarcerate everybody forever. And that'll put the brakes on reform. That's my concern. we have so much cause for hope. Who would have thought? Really, who would have thought 10 years ago that the bills that got through the Senate Judiciary Committee modifying the mandatory minimums, that we'd even have that conversation? That we would have the tepid but meaningful, contextually, reforms that are built into the First Step Act. I mean, we're talking about it, and that was unthinkable 10 years ago.
Yeah,
So
good.
hope springs eternal in me.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Yes, Paul.
So I'm going to skip the bridge too far part, although I do think that there.
Bridge gate too far.
Yeah, exactly. I can't even go there. But here's the reason I'm hopeful, aside from the things that my colleagues have said, which is I know a bunch of people in this room, some of whom are working inside the system and some of it outside the system. But I know a lot of people in a lot of places in the country who are elected district attorneys, state attorneys general, judges, public defenders, assistant United States attorneys. I know a lot of assistant United States attorneys all over the country. And yes, there are some number of those people who are not flexible thinkers. But by and large, it's a group of people who are enormously committed to the idea of seeking justice, which is, as Larry said this afternoon or late this morning, is the goal. His mission as the DA of Philadelphia is justice, and our collective good friend Loretta Lynch said many times when she was the Attorney General, the United States Department of Justice is the only government agency she knows of with a moral value for its name and not its function. And if the people I know and the people we all know who do this work are people who keep that in the front and the backs of their minds, I think ultimately we'll end up in a much better place than we are now, but partly egged on, I think, and encouraged and pushed and nagged by events like these and the people who are in this room who have the chance to say to their friends and their neighbors, their colleagues, and then sometimes their adversaries, you really need to think about this a different way. And I think ultimately, that has an effect. And so that's why I'm hopeful, because I think incrementally we will get to a better place. It's going to take a much longer time, I think, than any of us would like.
Sorry?
Jeremy, I have a 100th party to go to for my predecessor. And our alumna, Sonia Sotomayor, is our guest speaker, so I have to get down there to introduce her.
I think
That's a good excuse. Okay, that's a good excuse.
It's above average.
Exactly.
Thank you for having me, and anyone who has a question for me, if anything's prompted a question, please call me and I'll be happy to answer it. Thanks for letting me
Thanks for being here,
participate.
Si. I appreciate it very much. So give our birthday greetings to Mr. Morgenthau. That's quite a remarkable statement. And say hello to the justice. Okay. We are going to...
Right? That's an afterthought. Yeah, okay.
Right, and the justice, right. So we're going to take some questions. This is a time for community building, for getting to know each other a little bit. You've been I've watched, this is mostly a one-way discussion with a little bit of 10 minutes afterwards, but I thought we'd set aside some more time. And we'll start over here because I have had my back to you this entire time. Yes, sir. So, can you use the mic or a rabbinical voice, right?
First of all, thank you very much. It's been an incredible day, and ending the day on a note of hope is fantastic. And hope springs eternal, as you said, but hope doesn't move without activity, because that's just an empty dream. So I know that you're all part of that. My one comment is the fact that 1988, when Judge Weinstein was on his way to Washington to testify in front of the Sentencing Commission on the matters of the sentencing guidelines, he visited the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and the first thing the Rebbe said to him was, "Judge, the most important factor is to do things that are preventative. That's the key." And because you talk about preventative, I just want to just throw something out there. I think preventative starts in preschool. It doesn't start with the kid that's holding the gun or someone that's already in that environment. We're dealing with a social environment today that requires a whole shift in how we treat society and what values are, entitlement issues, materialism. It's a whole process, and it's all integrated. You cannot separate it. The Justice Department from the social benefits and the social structure of society are totally integrated. So when we talk about prevention, I think we need to take a more broad look at it and look at the entire picture to see how we can affect that.
And the question is?
So my question is, my question primarily is, I know we talk about prevention of that. How is it possible to move some of this prevention? You say there's $250 million worth, $250 million worth of money going to prevention. How can we move that into environments where in the long term, horizontally and vertically, we're going to make an effect on society?
Thank you. Anyone want to take on that question? The DA who heads the money has just left.
So, look, having been in an administration that was affirmatively interested in that and pursuing that kind of agenda, I can tell you that the government, in some ways, is a very frustrating animal to be able to try to get things done in the way that you're describing. And what I mean by that is, and I'll use reentry as an example. There probably still is in this administration a federal reentry council chaired by the Attorney General, and there were lots of ways in which President Obama was egging on various departments of the federal government to participate collaboratively in that effort. The Department of Education, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HHS, the EPA, places, organizations that had money that is focused on doing constructive, remedial, preventive things in all sorts of communities, but operate effectively in lots of ways as independent actors. And what we were advocating was, if there really is a federal reentry council, let's pick 6 places around the country where we're going to have a reentry court. That's fine. That's one place to start. But as the judges in my district would tell you, it's great, but how do we get housing? How do we get Section 8 housing for those people coming out of jail? Who's directing the? By the way, to be in Section 8 housing, you're probably not supposed to be a felon, so that's not really so helpful. To qualify for Obamacare, you had to be already out of prison, but it takes 6 months when you get out of prison to qualify. You need Obamacare like the day you leave prison. So I guess my point is that what I think really needs to happen in some way is a concentrated effort of coordination and collaboration among agencies in particular places at particular time to focus in particular ways on a particular community. Cy's trying to do that with his asset forfeiture fund. But it's very difficult for individual actors, very hard for DAs to do it in most jurisdictions. They don't have that kind of money, and they may not have that kind of power. It's very hard for the U.S. attorneys to do it without some imprimatur from Washington and some authority to try to bring people to the table. And so you really have to look for collaborative ways, and in some ways, the private sector and the nonprofit community, the NGO community, is really in a much better position to try to do that in some ways. But that's my frustration. It's very hard to do that.
So my 30-second answer to that would be, as much as energy is going into electing new reform-minded prosecutors, that same energy should go into different investment strategies at the local level to build strong communities. And that includes lots of things that you mentioned, plus others. Okay, we want to get other questions up. Yep.
My question is for Judge Gleeson. We modeled our POP program after your POP program, and I thank you again for all the help and guidance. Thank you, Judge Gleeson. The question I have is, you've left the bench, and you understand that sometimes it's hard to get some of our colleagues to embrace some of the principles that we're all talking about. Any thoughts on how to discuss adverse childhood experiences, talk about the neuroscience of addiction and mental health illness, to resistant colleagues or colleagues that perhaps don't yet understand or aren't really buying into the concepts? You've left the bench. Any ideas on how do we get the most bang for our buck when we talk about trying to bring along some of our colleagues, new and perhaps more seasoned?
Just keep doing it. Honest to God, that's, I think it's so, you mentioned, for example, one piece of this is we are so much farther along on the, from a neuroscience perspective on brain development, so a lot of people bore the brunt of these policies 15, 20 years ago, at a time when we had, we just didn't fully realize that, a 21-year-old is an adult in federal court, but they're not an adult up there. And now I got a 25-year-old and a 21-year-old, so I know this in 3D now. So there's that. There's talking about it. There's touting the successes of these front-end and alternative to incarceration programs. There is, I'm still very frustrated that the commission, these front-end drug programs like the POP program, thank you for mentioning it, but like the Youthful Offender Program, SOS, they've been propagated around the country to a degree. It's stalled, there's plateau, there's maybe 24, 25 of them. And that's because there are some places in this country, notwithstanding Booker, where unless an outcome has the blessing, as the imprimatur of that guidelines manual, it ain't never going to happen. There's not going to be a variance. There's not going to be a non-sentence, a non-incarceratory sentence, even for successful involvement in a drug-involved intensive supervision program. Change, we're so resistant to change, and the need for it needs to be repeated over and over again. The empirical basis for it needs to be cited. I'll hurry, I know you don't want me. I had a researcher from the Sentencing Commission come to our drug court and said, boy, this looks great, but we're not going to do anything until you do a multi-year controlled study. And I'm thinking first, I'm going to take a handful of people whose lives we can turn around and say, we're not going to do that. But my real thought is, when was the last time when you made a change in the guidelines that made things worse for defendants, that you required some multi-year controlled study? And where are you coming from? So there needs to be I think there really needs to be a complete fundamental attitude adjustment. Like, we did this severity thing for too long. Everybody agrees it's a problem. Why don't we start thinking about trusting judges? I'll stop.
Okay. We're going to take at least, if it's a short question, short answer, we may do more than one. Go ahead. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. And just address it to somebody.
I'm sorry. Oh, thank you. I don't know if this is a short answer, but
Well, that depends on them.
one thing that I was a federal prosecutor for a long time, appeared before Judge Gleeson many times, and one of the things that I've been wondering about, and your experience as the public defender in Tennessee made me think about it more, is to what degree overcriminalization and overlapping jurisdiction is contributing to mass incarceration. And what I mean by that is, here in New York, you could be charged in any of multiple district attorney's offices or up to 3 U.S. attorney's offices for the same crime. And there's a race to the bottom in terms of going to the jurisdiction where you think you might get the best result by law enforcement. So the U.S. attorney's offices and the district attorney's offices can be kind of at the mercy of their police parters.
I'm going to make that a question just so we get one more in.
So what is the role? I think.
Doris, do you want to handle your thoughts on it? Yeah.
There is overlapping in the Western District. We have the same thing. But the client will be prosecuted in the state and in the feds. And we have to tell them they're two different sovereigns, and they can do that. It's up to them. They said, but I'm pleading in federal court. I'm gonna plead in state court. Won't they just dismiss this? No, we can't make them dismiss it. And I see another federal defender here, and I think same thing in Michigan, isn't it? We can't make them dismiss them. So yeah, we're seeing that. They've turned federal court. When I first started practicing 30 years ago, we had real federal crimes. They brought cases where a person may have been an armed career criminal or a career offender. But now they just bringing, I want to share this one, if you just let me.
10-second one, yeah, go ahead.
I want to share this. Two $25 gift cards. Two $25 gift cards, a 19-year-old with no prior criminal record. Would you prosecute that in federal court?
No.
Well, it's prosecuted in my district, and now that kid is a felon. And you know he's going to suffer all the collateral consequences.
So you asked a research question about whether there's research by the contribution to mass incarceration. I don't know the answer to that. Last time I looked, which was 5 years ago, there was no research on that question. Maybe it's been done, maybe it hasn't been since. You, sir, you have the final question, and it'll be really brief, I know, and our answers will be
we have had 4, 5 actually exhibits of the simple fact that a prosecutor can do more to accomplish systemic, long-term justice in an afternoon than the rest of us in this room can accomplish in a career. Our job in working with all the prosecutors we deal with is to see that they understand that and that they do it.
We will take that not as a question, but as a benediction. So thank you for that. What a great panel we had. Please join me in thanking them. And we'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you, everyone.